In some of the upcoming lectures, I'll talk about pointer size. Now, to help avoid confusion, I want to discuss target platforms and the project configuration in this lecture briefly. Firstly, I want to talk about what the difference is between a 32-bit system and a 64-bit system. And I'm not going to discuss this in a lot of detail, but basically a 32-bit system can access 2 to the power of 32 bytes of RAM, whereas a 64-bit system can access 2 to the power of 64 bytes of RAM. So in other words, a 64-bit processor can access a lot more RAM. Basically, it's faster than a 32-bit system, and that's really all we are concerned with. Your operating system can run as a 32-bit or as a 64-bit application, but modern operating systems are 64-bit. Similarly, Visual Studio 2022 is a 64-bit application, so again it can have access to more RAM, and it is faster than a 32-bit application. And it's important to note that this is separate from the platforms that you target for your projects. So your operating system and your IDE, so in this case Visual Studio, is different from your actual application. Just because you develop in a 64-bit IDE such as Visual Studio 2022 does not mean that you cannot target a 32-bit system. So you can target 32-bit or 64-bit platforms, and your application will then run as either a 32-bit or 64-bit application depending on what you are targeting. A 32-bit application can run in a 64-bit operating system. And so as you'll see in this lecture, and I also mentioned this briefly in previous lectures, but some of the fundamental variables such as pointers will have a different size depending on the target platform. For example, if you target, or in other words build a 32-bit application, then your pointers will be 4 bytes. But if you build a 64-bit application, then your pointers will be 8 bytes. In this simple example, in the main function, I have a pointer. So this is one thing that you can run into in some of the upcoming lectures, where these can be confusing to you, because in those lectures the pointers will be 4 bytes, whereas if you build and run your project, the size of a pointer might be 8 bytes. In this example, you can say I have a pointer ptr, which is a pointer to an integer, and I initialize that to a null pointer. I print that out, the pointer is, and I print out the pointer, so of course we'll get an address here, and then I print out the size of the pointer using the size of operator. I pass in the pointer identifier ptr, and then I have the end of program, and I have send.get just in case I want to run that using the actual .exe file. Build and run this quickly, and this is what you may see. The pointer is null, so we're going to get a bunch of zeros, and then the size of the pointer is 8. In upcoming lectures, that will actually be 4. Now why is that? Well, that has to do with the configuration. Okay, so you can choose different configurations. This is for the solution. You can actually do a configuration per project, but we'll get to that shortly. Then you can select what hardware you want to target basically. So x64, which is 64-bit, or x86, which is for a 32-bit platform. So I'll change that to x86, and you'll notice in the other lectures, again this is recorded after some of the upcoming lectures here, but you'll notice that in those lectures I have this set to x86, okay? So if I build and run now, I get these zeros here, I get 8 zeros, and then the size of the pointer is 4 instead of 8. Okay, as I mentioned, you have the solution configuration, you have debug, release, and then you can select to open the configuration manager. These two come with the project by default when you create the project, debug and release, and also you can target 64-bit hardware or 32-bit hardware, and that is for your software, so that will actually be built in that configuration. I can click on the configuration manager to bring that up. Now once more, notice the difference here. We have debug, release, and then we can actually add a new active solution configuration, or we can edit an existing one. The debug configuration supports the debugging of the application, and your program will compile with symbolic debug information and no optimization, whereas the release configuration builds a version of the application that can be deployed. In the release configuration, your program does not compile with symbolic debug information and is fully optimized. Now what is symbolic debug information? Well, that is basically information or data about data, and it's basically going to link binary information to source code. So in other words, variable names, functions, and so on. And so that way you can debug using the source code as a reference, and then we can select an active solution platform right here. And we can also create per project. We can see we can create a new configuration, or in other words, we can change the configuration. We can set it to release, for example, even though up here the active solution configuration is set to debug, but the configuration for the project is set to release. Okay. And then you can also create a new one right here and you can also choose the platform. Visual Studio considers both the project level platform and the solution level platform, and C++ projects use Win32 and x64, but the solution platforms use x86 and x64. When you choose x86 as the solution configuration, then Visual Studio will select Win32, the Win32 platform for the C++ project. So you can see that if I choose for the active solution platform, if I choose x64, that will switch the platform for the project CPP demo in this example to x64. But if I switch that to x86, that will select Win32 here for the C++ demo project. I'll close that off. So where's the actual configuration? Because we have a bunch of options, you can right click on the project, for example. In this case I have CPP demo. I can go to properties, or what you can do is you can go to project, properties, and this is where we can basically modify the project configuration. So you can choose the configuration between debug and release. Notice that if I switch to, let's say, advanced, in the debug you have this use debug library set to yes, whereas with release, use debug libraries is set to no. And of course you can make a change here and click apply if you want to do that. And as I mentioned, you can create new configurations if you don't want to modify those. It's best to copy those, copy settings over and then make a change, because in most instances you want to keep the old settings as sort of a reference, especially as a beginner. So you can keep those around. It's much easier to switch between existing ones than having to modify one each time. I want to go back to the configuration manager, so I can click on these here and then go to the configuration manager, or I can go to build and then configuration manager. I can also right click on the solution and then I can go to the configuration manager. So let's say we want to create a new configuration and copy the settings over. So I click on this drop down, select new. Now we can select which settings to copy from, so I'll select debug and I'll click OK. Now you can choose between those, and if I go to the project, properties, now I can select that as my configuration, and in that way I'm not making changes to the original ones. For example, if I want to go to C++ and the preprocessor, I can go and select if I want to generate, actually that is under linker and under debugging. I can go and choose if I want to generate the debug information and to generate program database file, which is this PDB file. And that is going to hold debugging information. You can choose if you want to actually build that or not, right? But again, we're not concerned with that sort of stuff for right now. I'll just click cancel. We're not concerned with that stuff for right now. I just wanted to show you that these settings exist. Next, I would like to mention that we can also change the working directory of the program. So for example, if I right click on the project, go to properties again, we can change the output directory. It's currently set to the solution. It has this weird way of doing its parse using the $sign, and then the configuration. Now notice if I change from currently, you can select the active and then you can select a different one if you want, or a specific one. So let me select Win32 for example. Now notice if I change from Win32 to x64, the output directory is going to be different. If I select x64, we have solution, platform, and then configuration. Whereas with Win32 we only have the solution directory followed by the configuration. I'll set that back to x64 here. And if you right click on the project and you open that in the file explorer, I'll just bring that up. Then you can see we have this folder x64, and then we have release, and you can also have debug. So for example, if I bring this up, I'll set that to debug and then x64. Now I'll just make sure under build configuration manager that I set this configuration to debug as well, and that the active solution platform matches the platform of the project. And then what you can do is you can go to build and you can use Ctrl+B to build the current project. Okay, so the C++ demo in this case is my C++ project, or you can build the entire solution. Ctrl+Shift+B for that. Either one of those should be fine since we only have this single project. But with multiple projects, you want to build the entire solution if you have made a change to a project. So if I go and refresh here, you can see that under x64, we now have debug and release. And of course, if I go into that, we have the .exe file, which I can double click on to run. And one more thing is, you'll notice that these are different sizes. So the debug, for example, is 2.5 megabytes and the release is 2.11 megabytes, so it's slightly smaller. Just go and delete those. And then if I have the solution set to debug and I have the solution platform set to x64, I'll go to the configuration manager again and I'll select for the particular project, I'll select release and x64 is fine. And I'll do Ctrl B to build. Then you'll notice that we actually get release and not debug as you have defined with the solution configuration. We're actually using the configuration on the project. Just keep that in mind. Also, I mentioned, if I just go back here to the properties, I mentioned that the output directory is going to change. So currently it is set to the root, that is what the dollar stands for, the solution directory, platform, which was x64, and then the configuration. So again, that was build or release. Whereas if we change this to win32, we will have the root, which is the solution directory, followed by the configuration. So we will not have the platform. Change this to x86. And of course, you can make sure in the configuration manager that that is set to that. Set that to debug, for example, and win32. Then I'll just build the solution again. And if I go back to the root folder or the solution folder, you can see the solution is right here. You can see we have the platform x64, which we had before, but we don't have a x86, for example. It is going to put that right here in the root folder, basically under the configuration, as I mentioned. So as I mentioned again, right click on here, properties, win32, we have the root, so the solution directory, and the root of the configuration, so solution and then configuration. And that is what we have here. We have the solution directory, basically root directory. We can double click on here to open the solution up, and then we have the configuration, and then here is the exe file that I can actually double click and run if I want. Okay, so I've discussed quite a few things in this lecture. Some of it is beyond the scope of what we need to be concerned with for right now, but hopefully this gives you a better understanding of how things work, and that it'll lessen the confusion in some of the upcoming lectures where the pointers may show up as 4 bytes. The target platform in Visual Studio 2022 is set to x64 by default, right? And that is why you might get 8 bytes when you build and run instead of 4. So again, your IDE, in this case Visual Studio, and your operating system is not relevant here. What is important is the platform that you have targeted or built your application for. So if you build a Win32 or 32-bit application, then the size of the pointers will be 32 bits or 4 bytes. If you build a 64-bit program, then the pointers will be 64 bits or 8 bytes. Okay, so that is going to wrap up this lecture. I'll see you next time.